Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist's chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 54 with Dr. Margaret Rutherford, author of Perfectly Hidden Depression. And we're back. Welcome to Season 3. Thank you, as always, for stopping by. Welcome to 2021. And I know for a lot of us, we were really hoping it would just kind of reset and all go away like it was a bad dream. And, 2020 would just be over. Unfortunately, that has not happened. It has continued. We knew it wasn't going to just, everything wasn't just going to magically reset, but I think there was a little bit of hope in there, right? I mean, we can dream. I'm kicking off Season 3, and a lot of different things in the works. I'm really excited for today's guest, Dr. Margaret Rutherford, who she wrote a book called Perfectly Hidden Depression, and she's also the host of her own podcast, SelfWork. And in learning about the work that she does, I really connected with it. I think there's just so many stories out there of people that deal with depression that it doesn't look like your stereotypical, cookie cutter, meets all the DSM criteria for major depressive episode or clinical depression, quote unquote. And I think, Robin Williams is one that often gets referenced. I know there's so many people that I work with and have talked to that, they really struggle with that perfectionism and that drive and really pushing themselves, but underneath it is this, it's this mask that hides that depression that they struggle with. And even more so, I've heard a lot of people judge their own struggle with depression and other mental health struggles as well, of just, what right do I have, or I didn't get abused as a child, or this didn't happen to me, or that didn't happen to me, so I feel like I shouldn't be feeling this. I don't have a right to be depressed or be sad or be anxious when, there are, the starving children in Africa kind of defense of there are all these other people who have more of a right to, sadness or depression than I do. And in talking with Dr. Rutherford, she just has so much wisdom and has really, really done her homework. She's really put together a great book. And you can hear in just talking with her, sort of the light bulb that goes off of just, it's not a diagnosis that is recognized as yet, but I think that it should be. I think that it will be recognized in the very near future, and that this book will help so many people. If you're interested in checking her out, she can be found at drmargaretrutherford.com. So Rutherford is RUTHERFORD. So that's drmargaretrutherford.com. And I hope you enjoy the episode. So I have on the show today Dr. Margaret Rutherford, who is the author of Perfectly Hidden Depression and the host of the SelfWork podcast. So Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time. I'm glad we were able to do this. So now the Perfectly Hidden Depression, when I started to read it, I almost laughed and cried at the same time. It was almost like Psychopathology 101 when, they give you the DSM and they're like, okay, now everybody calm down. You're going to go through this and think you have 4 or 5 of these. And as I was reading through the criteria, I was like, oh no.
You'd be amazed at how many therapists have told me that, actually.
I probably wouldn't be amazed. Yeah, it's probably a sad truth. So can you talk a little bit about how did you come to, Perfectly Hidden Depression, this concept? Yeah, can you kind of tell a little bit about that?
Sure, John. I'd be more than happy to. By the way, the full name of the book is Perfectly Hidden Depression: How to Break Free from the Perfectionism That Masks Your Depression. And it's I will tell you how I came to. I've been in private practice since basically 1993 when I moved to Arkansas with my husband. And I didn't really want to write a book. I love being a therapist. I'm still not burned out after 27 years of doing it. So I was happily engaged in being a therapist, but my only son, left for college about 8 years ago, and I found, even with just one kid, I had a lot of time on my hands and energy. So I actually began a website about empty nest, and I called it Nest Ache. And I wrote there for a year and a half, but I began itching to write more about mental health. As I told my son, I sort of got over him leaving. There just wasn't that much to write about it. Of course, I'm joking. It's continually being something for me to try to work around, but since he's on the West Coast. But anyway, so I created the website creatively named drmargaretrutherford.com and began writing more about mental health and mental illness and what I do, 4 or 5 days out of the week. And it really did well. But of course, I was writing a weekly blog post. And so I sat down one day and thought, what am I going to write about this week? And I thought about some of these people that I had seen through the years. And one of the stories is in the book that almost one of them tragically lost her life. That I realized I had initially probably seen them as anxious and that I had given them an anxiety diagnosis. But the more, or perhaps they had an eating disorder, or perhaps they had generalized anxiety or panic attacks, or they were struggling with a benzodiazepine use. But the more I talked with them, the more I realized that there was this incongruence between what they said and what they were talking about and the emotional expression they used to talk about it. For example, my classic example is a woman that was telling me about, she said, well, you asked me about sexual abuse. This is about the 3rd or 4th session. I said, yeah, I did. And she said, well, I didn't really think about it when you asked, because I said no, but, I was raped the week before I went to college, and there was this bright smile on her face, John. Yeah. And she was telling me about this, but it's not very important, and so many people have it worse than I do, and it's never happened again, blah, 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 blah. And I looked at her and
common story.
Yes. Do you realize that if I turned the sound down in this session, if that was a possibility, and I had you look at it, it would look like you were telling me what you had for lunch. Yeah. And there was just no connection with how painful that had been. Wow. And I saw this over and over again with my patients, some of my patients. So I wrote about these people, and I called it The Perfectly Hidden Depressed Person. Are you one? I don't know, the term kind of came to me. It seemed to fit. Mm-hmm. And because what was underneath that was an underlying depression for sure, not necessarily looking like the classic depression, but a depression. Mm-hmm. And at that time, John, I would be ecstatic if I got 50 shares on a post. I mean, I'd just be jumping up and down going, whoa, I'm coming on my way. You know? And the post went viral. Um, and I didn't even know what going viral was. Someone had to tell me what it was. And then I was writing for the Huffington Post at the time, and they put it on their website. And I had forgotten that I had left my email on the bottom of the post. The next
It's
day,
the price of viral.
I had received hundreds of emails saying, "This is me. How did you get in my head? I'm going to go home and talk to my family tonight." So I started looking. And of course, I found Brene Brown, who talks about imperfection and vulnerability. I don't know where I'd been living, under a rock, I guess, that I had not heard of her before then. But even her writing, and I didn't let myself read too much of it because I didn't want to be too influenced by what she had to say.
Mm-hmm.
But even in her writing and her research, which of course is phenomenal, I didn't see a connection clinically between perfectionism and depression. I didn't hear her talking about, she talked about what you could do about it, but she didn't talk about why it existed
Mm-hmm.
as much as I wanted to as a clinician, to kind of get at the bottom of this. So I began researching what was in the popular literature about this link. I didn't find a lot. There were several books, workbooks, and books talking about how to not be a perfectionist. In fact, they've done very well. But no one was talking about addressing the why and what's underneath and what's fueling it. So, frankly, with some encouragement from my family and friends and blogger friends I made at that time, I decided to try to write a book. And sure enough, 3.5 years later, it was published. So this topic sort of found me. It's something I went to when we were all getting together back at the holidays. One of my clinician friends came up to me and he said, we all know this exists, but you've put a name to it. And that's what I'm trying to do. This book is not only meant for people who are experiencing this syndrome, as I call it, a syndrome, but also for mental health clinicians who are too rigidly following the criteria for classic depression. And they, just like me, many times in my career, I'm sure, I misdiagnosed people and I didn't pay attention to this disjunctiveness. Is that a word? Not fitting between what they were saying and how they were saying it.
Yeah. Well, there's so many things I wanted to highlight from what you just said.
As I said, I can talk about this.
Yeah. I'm very passionate about it. Yeah. It's, so often as a clinician, the client that, kind of slow plays the abuse history. And it's somewhat understandable of the getting to know you and building rapport kind of phase. It usually takes a couple of sessions, and then they'll share, "Oh yeah, by the way," or didn't I mention to you that this happened? And then it's usually this bomb that you're like, "Nope, I'm pretty sure I would have remembered that if you had shared that.
That would have gotten a star in my notes." Right.
And often followed quickly by the shift in distortion of
discounting it, denying
it wasn't a big deal, or that was years ago, or the starving children in Africa, like everybody else has it worse off, kind of thing. But then also, what you had said about as a clinician, thumbing through the DSM and okay, it's got 3 out of the 5. It's got, adhering too rigidly to, closed, case closed. It's anxiety.
I was so lucky in that. So what I did, John, is as I was trying to figure this out myself and reading and researching, I began writing fairly, not weekly blog posts about it because I wrote about other things, but I began trying to formulate my own ideas through blog posts, as sort of learning as I went. And at the end of the blog post, I was asking for volunteers who might identify with this. Would they risk talking to me? And sure enough, over about a 3 or 4 month period of time, I had probably 70, 75 people from all over the world, principally the United States, but there were still people in Great Britain and Australia and New Zealand and that were reaching out, South Africa, Denmark, I remember. Anyway, so I began interviewing these people. I had to filter out some because they didn't really fit the rubric, but and more than half of them had attempted suicide at some time in their life, and more than half of them had gone to therapy or tried therapy and been told, you're overworked, you're fatigued, you're too anxious. I don't think you're really depressed. You look great. I don't really know why anyone sent you to me. And so I remember the story of one guy, it's in the book, where he went to a psychiatrist and the psychiatrist gave him a depression inventory to take. And he took it like someone who experiences perfectly hidden depression. He had to look perfect, And so one of the questions was, do you ever feel hopeless? No, I don't feel hopeless. And he tried to hang himself 3 weeks later. Luckily, one of his family members found him. And he was in the hospital, and the psychiatrist actually came to see him. Somewhat miffed is the way the patient told it. And the psychiatrist looked at him and said, well, why didn't you tell me? And the guy said, you asked the wrong questions.
Wow.
If the question had been, if you ever feel hopeless, would you admit it? Would you reveal it? And the answer would be no. So there would be a clue as to what's going on, if, again, someone was honest. I've had clinicians come up to me and say, but how are we supposed to know things are happening if a patient doesn't tell us? Yeah. I don't have a crystal ball. You don't have a crystal ball. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, true. But if you're aware that this other overlooked or more silent kind of depressive episode can exist, or depression in a different kind of form can exist, then perhaps that very awareness might lead you to be a little suspect and begin to say, gosh, where are the holes in this person's story? And what, can they access painful emotions? Can they, or are they into such denial that I need to pay attention?
Sure. And so often also, as we, work our way through like continuing ed trainings and things like that, especially if it's something we're not familiar with that we're getting training on, afterwards, it has that like, oh my gosh, like you kind of start going back through, your historical caseload of like, oh, I bet I bet I missed it here. Or, yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Now, just for the listeners, at present, perfectly hidden depression is not a DSM official diagnostic code. It's you describe it more as a syndrome.
I'm not quite that narcissistic thing. I've come up with a whole diagnosis all by myself in little old Arkansas. No. In fact, it's interesting that you asked that question. I loved when I saw it on your list of questions for me, because I also reached out to people who are actually doing professional research on perfectionism. And one of them is Dr. Gordon Flett in Canada at the University of York there. And he and his colleague, Dr. Paul Hewitt, were so kind enough. They were very kind to me and were excited about the book and shared some of their information with me, which was just a mind-blowing experience. And I asked him, I said, so should perfectionism be a criteria for depression? And he sort of said, oh, no. Perfectionism is a character trait in his rubric. And so it is not, in fact, it would limit it to make it a part of the criteria for depression. But it is a character trait that can be, of course, it can lend itself to highly successful people and people who really strive for excellence. And that's I'm one of those people, I consider myself perfectionistic. I've checked out my background and all this stuff and my equipment before we got on. I mean, I'm into detail, but there's a difference between perfectionistic people who can engage in that kind of seeking to do well, but also consider it a learning process, and they can accept their mistakes. Mm-hmm. And perfectionism that is fueled by fear and shame and where it is a very goal-oriented, accomplishment-oriented kind of way of living your life. And that's what can be so difficult. So actually, no, it's what I call a syndrome. Probably, of course, you know this, but probably the most well-known syndrome is codependence. And before codependence came into our language,
lexicon, yeah.
it was just But what I read about in the wonderful book Codependent No More was that actually they kind of sat around in somebody's living room and said, they being both people who were married or partnered with alcoholics, what do we have in common? And some mental health professionals, and they came up with this list of traits of codependence. And so then it became, ta-da, a syndrome. And so that's how I consider perfectly hidden depression. It's a syndrome. It's a group of behaviors and beliefs that you will find together. You will often find together, like kind of salt and pepper.
Well, and to be fair to you, I mean, even, the great Bessel van der Kolk, his the diagnosis that he was really pushing obviously did not get accepted, and the chronic trauma, or I forget the exact term that he uses, but it's
sexual addiction is the same way. Sexual addiction hasn't been accepted as a diagnostic.
And the same with video game addiction and things like that. They're like, okay, we're researching it. It'll probably be in the next one, or things like that. Right. And so to kind of jump in terms of the 10 criteria, or the 10 criteria, 10 characteristics, can you kind of go through those?
Sure. They're very commingled, but I tried to do my best. Again, I am not a researcher. I haven't done any research since my dissertation. So I did what was necessary to get the three letters after my name. Not official research.
I mean, you've been doing the,
the
client work.
Yes, I have been, but I don't get published.
Don't sell yourself short. Yeah. Come on.
Well, that's true. That's true. I did get a book published. I guess that's pretty good. So basically, the first one is about that there has to be a strong, constant, critical, shaming voice and a fearful voice that is just, it's this backdrop of in your mind that's constantly going, saying things like, that wasn't good enough. You'll never be anything. I don't know why you think you're this important. People won't like you if you don't weigh a certain amount, or if you don't lead this committee, you're slacking off. I mean, it's a voice that's constantly inside your head. You also you see your worth as in accomplishments. And so it is not, you don't feel innately worthy. It's only when you do something or perform at a certain level that you feel worthy. People like this tend to stay in their head a lot. They're very overly analytical. And so they don't express, or they deny or discount feelings that are important, that most of us would consider hurtful or painful or sad or fearful. They really just totally deny that. Heavily tied in with that is, again, this is what the researchers have found, that these folks can identify feelings. They can say, oh, yes, my mother-in-law has cancer and we are so worried about her, and it's really terrible. But if you ask them to feel that in front of you, to feel their sadness, to feel their concern, no. They don't like to do that.
Yeah, it's almost like
they don't have the skills.
A quick pit stop at the emotion, but they move on very quickly.
They'll say things like, oh, and they'll kind of laugh and go, if I started crying, I'd never stop. Or, I'm just not a crier, never have been. Mm-hmm. Another trait is that they tend to worry and need a lot of control. And so, in fact, oftentimes, now, they're not people that are known as worriers. For example, if you have generalized anxiety disorder, everyone kind of knows that you tend to worry a lot. You may be hypervigilant. These people also worry, but they tend to fix it by staying in control or thinking they're in control. These people are also really great friends. They sincerely care about other people. And so They are there when you need them. They are there when you don't need them. They're just there. And yet, what you really realize when you stop and think about the friendship is, I don't know much about him. I don't even know what his family was like, or I don't know if he's happy in his job, or I don't know if what makes her tick. And they'll look at you and go, oh, well, if anything was wrong, I'd let you know. Well, no, they wouldn't. Okay. So, because that sharing, that vulnerability is very, very difficult for them. They tend to, and this is important for clinicians to know actually, but also people who might be in this, it is likely, or it is certainly possible, that they fit the criteria for some kind of clinical diagnosis. Usually it's an aspect of a mental illness that has to do with control, like eating disorders, like binging and purging and anorexia, like generalized anxiety. Even bipolar 2 can look something like this. Alcoholism or some kind of problem with substance abuse, because they try to maintain control by shoring up themselves by escaping. Panic attacks. So I never want someone to go, oh, I just have perfectly hidden depression, and not realize that there could be an accompanying or a concurrent mental health disorder. These folks are also their blessings counters. What I mean by that is gratitude is an incredible gift. And in fact, when I went walking this morning, I don't know, I was sort of in a bad mood, and and the wind was blowing in the trees. It was absolutely gorgeous. And I thought, I'm so grateful to be out here in nature and be walking, and it just made me feel better, But the problem here is that people will quickly say, I can't even admit that there is an underbelly to my blessings, meaning I'm so blessed to have 4 children that are healthy, and that's wonderful. But that's 4 sets of homework and 4 school lunches and 4 soccer games or tennis games or whatever, piano lessons or whatever they're into. And that can be overwhelming at times. So they count their blessings, but they don't allow themselves to see the vulnerabilities. And the last one is that they're usually incredibly successful at work. We admire and reward perfectionism. We will promote you if you meet all your deadlines, not only on time, but early, and you get more done than we think you could do. The problem is that, and we'll talk more about socially prescribed perfectionism in a minute, but the problem is it's a treadmill that just keeps going. And so, but what happens in their intimate relationships is interesting. Actually, I think in the trait I just said, their emotionally intimate relationships are problematic. There are lots of ways for them to be problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just from the book, it's may enjoy success within a professional structure, but struggle with emotional intimacy in relationships. Yeah.
Right. And that's often they'll choose somebody else who also doesn't want to particularly have emotional intimacy in a relationship. They might attract someone who's narcissistic, who really wants somebody who's overly responsible and will always have their hand up in the air and say, give it to me, I'm responsible. There may be people who are sort of under-functioners who will want to be with an over-functioner, and will choose that kind of dynamic in a relationship. So there are lots of. And then, of course, there are people I hear from all the time who say, I've been married to this person for 12 years, and I've been trying to get her or him to share some of the things about themselves that are sad, or I know their best friend moved away and never have they talked about it, and I don't know how to reach them. So it's not that they don't have partners that really want to get to know what they're vulnerable about, but they won't allow it. They struggle to.
And as you were describing those 10, it made me think of sort of this like Martha Stewart, Brie Van de Kamp, sort of caricature of, like great friend, cares a lot about other people and shows up when they're suffering, but I'm always okay. I never need to be the one that needs the help or the support. And will almost like run themselves ragged, volunteering for everything, and
Right.
the accomplishments and success in whatever
You're
their
talking
area
about, I
is.
had to search through my memory. Bree Vanderkamp was like a
Desperate Housewives. Yeah, she
Desperate
was.
Housewives. Yeah. And of course, we'd have to ask Martha if
Yeah.
all that pie dough and plants is about busyness, or how much. Maybe people really know her well. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, thinking back through just the work that
But you're
I've
right.
done.
That's the sort of caricature.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. And I could also see a lot of, execs or things like that, people, doctors, or, very successful in their area, but, and some of that, like, instead of like the extroverted, picture of like Robin Williams, where he's like funny and always happy, change that out for like the successful and responsible and in control, whereas on the inside, more the crying on the inside, or more the that feeling of always on the treadmill, always chasing.
That is true, but there's I asked all the people that came to be interviewed, why did you agree to this? And to a T, John, they said, I don't want anyone else to live the life I've lived. It is so lonely. No one knows me. It is so lonely. And it was interesting. I had people from all kinds of professions contact me. One, somewhat ironically, is a pretty well-known motivational speaker. I had a brain surgeon contact me. I had this woman from a very well-populated state who is one of the heads of their state's advertising campaigns. I mean, these people are highly successful, and yet know that at their core there is trauma, or there is pain that they have almost unconsciously suppressed and denied and pushed away. I use the term in the book called, kind of putting it in your emotional closet, which is not, new to me. Everybody's used that. But it's like you stuffed it way back in your closet, maybe consciously at first as a child, but it became so automatic that it became an unconscious thing that you did. And now when you experience something that's sad, you just goes away. I had one woman say, if it's not big enough for the box, if my box is not big enough to contain it, I'll build a bigger box.
Wow.
And so these people are both consciously and unconsciously, mostly the people I'm really talking about are the people that do it unconsciously. It's so rote for them that, many people have contacted me and said, it wasn't until I saw the term perfectly hidden depression that I thought, that's what my gut's been trying to tell me. My gut has been trying to sound an alarm to me that something is wrong, or they're becoming suicidal. And they tell absolutely no one. I would challenge your audience to say how many, I imagine all of them know someone, or know someone who knows someone who's had a friend,
or are someone
who's had a friend, or they themselves have thought, someone has died by suicide, died by their own hand, and no one could figure out what was going on. Everybody was surprised. In fact, I had some people from Florida contact me about a month ago. One of them had a friend who was this leader in the community, loved her children, was honored in the community, and had done all these wonderful things, successful in her own right. And she killed herself, and her husband found my book on her nightstand.
Wow.
I couldn't breathe for a second when I heard that comment. It made me even more determined to get the message out, actually.
Yeah, definitely. I could definitely see that. Wow. And as you bring that up, yeah, again, going back through kind of the Rolodex of my caseload in the past of oftentimes, especially when somebody dies by suicide and it wasn't, overt, oh, well, it was major depression, or it was, when it does fall under the perfectly hidden depression, I find for the people who are left behind, it's so much more damaging. Like they just are so confused.
I should have seen this. What did I miss? Um, yes, I would totally agree with that. That's a great thing to say because you're right. And what I have tried to say to people, in fact, we're trying to work toward a model where we work together. Um, a mother who lost her son this way, and she contacted me several years ago, and um, the circumstances are even more tragic because one of the young man's friends had contacted the high school counselor, and the high school counselor had actually called him in and said, "We got a report that you're suicidal." And the guy said, "Nah, so it's just a bad night. I'm a teenager." And his parents were not contacted, and 3 weeks later he killed himself. So, now maybe the parents are listening and going, "Oh my God, I'm going to freak out here. If I don't, how am I supposed to know that?" Again, I think that if you are a family where you are talking about vulnerability with your children, if you are modeling that for them, then they are much more likely to come to you with their struggles than they are if your family is one of these that doesn't allow that to be stated or accepted. And that's a whole, we can go in that direction if you want to.
Yeah. Potentially, yes. But in terms of just the work that you're seeing throughout the country and throughout the world, the people that you've interviewed and people that have reached out off of the book, are there particular trends that you're seeing in who is struggling with this or, yeah. You're listening to OTC episode 54 with Dr. Margaret Rutherford, author of Perfectly Hidden Depression. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
You're seeing throughout the country and throughout the world, the people that you've interviewed and people that have reached out off of the book, are there particular trends that you're seeing in who is struggling with this or, yeah.
I've been contacted by I must point out that my book is not a New York Times bestseller. I mean, I'm getting I'm getting a lot of people like you who are wanting to know more about it, and that is very pleasing to me, but I'm still pushing this message. So, but I have been contacted by people and reporters, parents who live in areas of the country where there is a lot of pressure on kids to get into the the best school they can. And those are usually really dream schools for most people, and that there's a lot of pressure in those communities and in those schools. So certainly I've heard from those people, but I will say, I live in Arkansas, and I wouldn't call this an area where, there are some parents who want their kids to get into Stanford or Harvard, but it's certainly not a very wealthy area, or the socioeconomic status is diverse. But there have been many people who've contacted me from various socioeconomic backgrounds and races and genders and everything. So actually, I'm sad to report somewhat that I think that this
kind of transcends all of those.
it transcends some of those because, what I wrote a post and began trying to filter out or ferret out how people got to this place, how they, when you look at the literature on perfectionism, there's certainly a cultural component there's a cultural component to depression. I will say that I've just been contacted by my publisher, for example, that when the foreign rights to the book came to Korea, that there was a bidding war in Korea because of how well they think the book is going to do there in an Asian culture where there is so much pressure. And so, that's interesting to me, that the book may do very, quote unquote, very well there because it's very needed. But I'm just beginning to sort of gather that kind of information. I've had podcast hosts from all over the country contact me and really be very interested in this. You're in Pennsylvania. I've had California, Texas, Florida, the South, Mississippi. I mean, all over. Illinois, Montana. I don't think there's necessarily a group. Certainly, when we think about the counting your blessings criteria, and I mean no disservice to people of faith. There are a lot of people out there whose faith is very important to them, but some people's faith gets in the way of them admitting that there are issues and problems, meaning I'm not spiritual enough, I don't believe enough, or I would not ever feel sad, I would not ever feel down in the dumps, or certainly not, I would never think about taking my own life. So the very fact that they begin shaming themselves for not having enough faith is part of the problem.
Oh, and yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times we can misuse our faith or our scriptures depending on our religious beliefs and things like that. It made me think of, take heart in, just when you have trials, it's almost like a badge of honor, or it's like, it's to be expected. Mm-hmm. And I think also a lot of parenting and past generations, they're like, you don't have anything to cry about. I'll give you something to cry about. Maybe,
yes,
as
exactly.
You've been talking about counting your blessings, I keep hearing, Bing Crosby, playing in the background from White Christmas, falling asleep counting your blessings. I'll not butcher it for you all and sing it, but
But, I did want to point out that it's not just in families where vulnerability is scoffed at or even ridiculed, something like that. There could be abuse and trauma in the family, and, you get yelled at, you'll never amount to anything, and by darn, you say, yes, I will. But it also somewhat surprisingly can be in families where that kind of dynamic doesn't exist, but it does exist that you're expected to be highly accomplished. You're expected, even you might be enmeshed, what's called enmeshed with a parent. Your job is to make them happy by being who they need you to be, rather than by following your own dreams. And you can man comes to mind who had that kind of upbringing, and in his adult life, he basically in his whole adult life, he let other people define who he was supposed to be. Then, of course, what happened by his 30s? Well, he began having affairs because he needed some outlet to do what he thought he needed to do or wanted to do. And so when he became suicidal after his third affair was discovered, he came to me, and we began slowly uncovering this tendency of his to, in fact, he said to me, it's so ironic because here I am, I've had 3 affairs, but people come up to me and my wife all the time and say, y'all just have the perfect family. Isn't that amazing? And so, he had, and actually his wife had to do it, do the work with him, that they had to really look at what was going on with him. Obviously, that's not an excuse for what he did, but they had to work on their own relationship and how it become more real.
Sure. Well, and like you said, figuring out the why, what's the root of it,
yes.
What's it come from, and the that idea with, you were saying, in some families, the legacy family where, everyone went to, fill in the blank school or fill in the blank
Sure.
profession of,
Sure.
we come from a long line of, doctors or lawyers or things like that.
Or plumbers,
Yeah.
or coal miners. I don't care what it is.
Yeah, just any pressure to, okay, your self-worth is in this.
Right.
And yeah, we were kind of talking about, perfectly hidden depression often being identified in some of those more anxiety-based diagnoses. Do you sort of see that as like they're happening simultaneously? It's like a chicken or the egg, where it starts off as, not always a traumatic event, but sometimes, and then it grows into PhD, or how do you see it?
That is a really good question. I don't think it's a chicken or the egg thing necessarily. I think I don't know, could be. I think that, let me make this distinction. Perhaps this is a bit of going around the barn, like we say in Arkansas, but let me go there. There's another group of people who are called, you'll see it in the literature, in the popular literature, they call themselves I have smiling depression, or I have high functioning depression. And these are people who are very aware they're depressed. They know they don't want to get out of bed. And they know it like as soon as their eyes open that morning. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to get out of bed all day. And they make themselves, and they put a smile on their face, and they look for medicines that work, and they exercise, and they do everything, and they do everything they can do to manage their depression, and they put a smile on their face. That doesn't mean that people who can't do that they are more melancholic or sad or really overwhelmed or demoralized by depression are less than those people. It's just for some reason they have that skill set.
Different presentation.
That's one set of people. The set of people which they probably will identify with the book, actually, because they also probably have done some of that discounting and denying. But the people who really are the focus of what I'm talking about would never tell you they're depressed. Because they look at those criteria and say, I'm none of that. And in fact, I'm even ashamed that I might look at that criteria because I've got so many blessings. Admitting vulnerability is hard. So they have a lot of shame around that. So what I'm trying to suggest when you say, does anxiety and depression, are they commingled in perfectly hidden depression? One of the criteria is worry and a need for control. And that is to manage anxiety a lot. These are not laid back people by any stretch of the imagination. And so they could have a fair amount of anxiety, but the important thing is both the anxiety and the depression is suppressed. It's managed by control. It's managed by either dissociation or depression or suppression or repression, denial, discounting. And so it is the way I see it, John, is to say, the people that I have worked with, as you begin to allow them and to guide them and to give them space to realize their sadness or their fear or their anger, that they do get anxious about that. It's as if this persona that I have spent perhaps all my life creating, maybe consciously, but often it's, again, to what I said before, it's become an unconscious process. When you bring that into your consciousness more, you can get very anxious because what your belief system is that you will be rejected, you won't be cared about, you won't be respected, you will lose all the belief that other people have in you. Your world will fall apart.
Everything that you've built over your
Everything that you built will fall apart. And interestingly enough, I've had so many people that I've worked with, because a lot of people have come to my practice because of this, and they will say, rather than my world falling apart, my world has expanded. And because I am now free within it, I'm still a hardworking person. I just believe now it's innately in me. I don't have to keep the thumb in my back. I want to do well because I am, that is in my character. I just am a hard worker. And yet when they realize that the anxiety they've been pummeling themselves with or the shame or fear that they've been pummeling themselves with is unnecessary, they can take a big breath. I've said in the book, Andrew Solomon, who is a beautiful writer about depression, says the opposite of depression, of course, he's talking about classic depression, the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. And so I borrowed his pattern, and I said, if the opposite of classic depression is vitality, then the opposite of perfectly hidden depression is self-acceptance.
Wow. Say that again, please, because that was
the
amazing.
The opposite of perfectly hidden depression is self-acceptance. Maybe you do tend to be anxious. You accept that. Maybe you are sad. You accept that. Maybe one of your strengths is being very patient. One of your strengths is you're a good problem solver. One of my strengths is that I studied and focused and got a PhD. That's a strength of mine. Do I have vulnerabilities? You betcha. Did I make a mess out of my life in my 20s? You betcha. Those are not things I'm proud of necessarily, but those vulnerabilities, those mistakes, those things that may carry some shame for me do not define me any more than the 3 letters I have after my name. And that's what I think people come to as they begin to work through the book, that they realize that their strengths are part of what they can accept and enjoy, and their vulnerabilities are also part of what they can accept and enjoy about themselves, or have exist, but they neither one define them.
And it made me think of, in the beginning of the book, you talk about, that detachment from painful emotions by staying in your head, and that detachment requires significant compartmentalization.
Yes.
And it made me think of a lot of the personality disorders are very low awareness, like narcissism and borderline personality disorder. But it also made me think back to, I think it was the DSM-4 in the OCD criteria. There was like that subtype that was like low awareness. And it was almost this like loophole for getting out of having the OCD diagnosis, and I can't.
Interesting.
I can't quite remember the wording of it.
I don't remember that at all. That's fascinating. I'll have to look at that up. It
talked about the lack of awareness of the obsessions and compulsions, and usually where I found most people getting hung up is they usually had an explanation for why they engaged in the obsessions and the compulsions.
That is so interesting. I'm going to write that down. In low awareness OCD. Interesting. When I studied, we were still the DSM-3. So
it's come a ways.
So I sort of skipped over the DSM-4. I used it, but I was busy raising a child, and I just said, "Okay, what's the diagnosis?"
Well, yeah, they got everybody with 5 when they were like, "Okay, we're switching to the ICD codes," and you're like, "Wait, what? Now I have to."
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the things that I love so much about the book is it seemed like this perfect blend of psychoeducation and examples of case studies and kind of workbook type, resources.
I'll tell you a funny story, okay? When I first had this book in mind and the way I presented it to the publishing companies who I would hope someone would buy it, I just described this dynamic. I just described this, what I now call a syndrome. And my new harbinger, who eventually published the book, said, "We're very interested in this book. but you have to come up with a treatment strategy and you have to do it in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I went, excuse me?
Yeah. No problem.
2 weeks. No problem. So I actually just sat down and thought, okay, what do I do with every patient? What are the stages that I have in every individual patient that I see? And so what I did was, because I do sort of a duality of cognitive behavioral techniques as well as family systems techniques. And if I had to put myself in a square peg somewhere, so anyway, and also do Margaret Rutherford techniques. But so I came up with this 5-stage kind of treatment strategy. The first stage is consciousness, meaning simply you become conscious that something is a problem, sort of this like this low insight. You have to address the fact that your best friend, perfectionism, lies to you and cheats on you and is often does not have your best interest at heart. And so that is a whole stage in and of itself. And then commitment is the next stage. And that really for a perfectionist can be very hard, because you can set okay, I'm going to do something about this, and then either you don't do it perfectly, or you start out with something that's way too big, and so you fail, and so that's horrible. Or again, you have all this fear and anxiety you're trying to cope with that we talked about a few minutes ago. The third stage is confrontation, and what I'm talking about there are what is underneath the why of this perfectionism. What rules are you following that you adopted as a child as a wonderful strategy at the time that worked and kept you safe and kept you emotionally safe and secure? But how are you bringing those into your adult life where they're really not necessary or not even appropriate anymore? And I give all kinds of examples about that in the book. The fourth stage is connection, and there is a specific therapeutic technique that I talk about called a trauma timeline in the book, which many therapists use. And you go back with compassion through your life to acknowledge what are the positive things that happen. We're not just talking about the negative or painful things and that made an impact on you as a person, but also the painful things. And you literally go through your entire life, or as long as much as you want to. And then, you begin to make connections and you can see patterns. And then you go back again with compassion and you begin to try to emotionally connect with those feelings. It's very difficult for people who have this syndrome. Then the last one is change. Because as a therapist, if there's one thing I've learned, insight is great. Insight gives you context. Insight helps you connect the dots. Insight's wonderful, but where you get your hope is when your behavior starts changing.
Well, and I remember Lori Gottlieb talking about insight is the booby prize of therapy.
Yeah. It's right. Oh, I was an aha moment. Well, great. Now what are you going to do about it? So, but what I did, and, I really wanted to call this book a workbook because it does have over 60 very guided exercises, and they're not easy. They start out much easier, but they get harder and harder. And of course, one of my perfectionistic readers contacted me and she said, well, I just went on and jumped to the trauma timeline. And I said, and how did you do? Oh, it was terrible. No, I gave up. And I said, because you didn't let yourself practice vulnerability. Yeah. You're practicing getting to know you, sort of spilling your guts even to yourself a little bit.
You got to love the driven perfectionist skipping all the pre.
So you kind of like when you open your pantry or your refrigerator to find out what you need to order. That's kind of like what someone with perfectly in depression does. The first thing you do to your emotional closet where you got all that crap stuffed is you go, oh yeah, that's that memory, and there's that. Oh, I need to work on that. Oh yeah, that's in there. Oh, forgot that's in the back. It's back behind this other thing. You kind of look at it like what is in there, and then you shut the door because it's too much to ask yourself to begin to take things out. So that's how guided the exercises are, and they are an integral part of the book. And in fact, I'm starting an Instagram, IGTV series here in a couple of weeks because so many people are skipping over the exercises that I'm going to, or they said, oh yeah, I just needed to mentally embrace the concept before I did the real work. And there's even a criticism of the book on Goodreads that says, I thought the first 3 chapters were fantastic. And then the 4th chapter started where you talked about that stages of healing stuff. It was like a therapy session, and I didn't like it.
Tell me more about
and
that.
I thought, well, gosh, that's kind of like what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Now, there are obviously lots of comments during the book that if this gets too hard, especially if you have trauma you're trying to work on yourself, that can be very overwhelming. And there's every 25 pages in this 200-page book, I said, if this is getting too hard, you need to seek
multiple
therapy.
check-ins. They must have skipped those pages. And yeah. Well, and that's I use the Courage to Heal workbook quite a lot. And I always love the checklist at the beginning, but then that whole first section deals with the, okay, we're building up your toolkit to like prepare you for the work you're going to be doing later on. And yeah, a lot of people skip that stuff and they're like, I'm just going to, quick like a Band-Aid. Let's get this over with.
Right. And so I'm going to use something that needs a chainsaw, and I'm going to bring out a kitchen knife, and that's supposed to be enough, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, and yeah, I just, as I was reading through it, just again thinking back on cases I have going now, or I do supervision in our group practice, so passing it on to all of the clinicians. I really can't thank you enough for the work that you've done.
Well, thank you so very much. It's very kind.
Like you mentioned with the colleagues of like, you've given it a name, so it's so amazing. Are there, you were saying Instagram and the IGTV, so that people can look for that in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I have an Instagram account already, and I do, especially if I have a blog post about it or a podcast about it, it's there. And I just actually started playing around with Instagram last year. I don't have a whole lot of followers. I have, I don't know, I've forgotten. But I really want to use that. I think that's a really good venue because some of them I probably won't talk about very long at all. Some of them I might talk about in more detail. And so people can use that venue. I also have a Facebook closed group. You can reach it at facebook.com/groups/SelfWork. That actually I'm doing a Facebook Live with them on Sunday about this very topic as well. So that's a way of sort of getting in touch with me and getting a little more interaction with me.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And with the book, I mean, it made me think of those in like AA or NA, that idea of like those first 2 steps are a doozy. They usually weed almost everybody out. Do you try to, if you're working individually with somebody, do you try to have them, share this with a spouse that you're yes. Let them know you're working through this, or you're kind of picking away at this? Yeah.
Sometimes the spouse is the person that you may not aware. Want to tell. Yeah, especially that narcissist you're partnered with. So, in fact, often I'll have somebody say, well, what about my high school friend? They live 500 miles away, but I feel safer. I go, fine, that's great. Tell your high school friend that lives 500 miles away. Yes, I encourage from almost the get-go to say part of the journey here is to finally let someone in, even if you look at them and you go to lunch or you talk on your text or whatever, and you just say, I'm not the person that sometimes I portray myself to be. I'm not always that person. You can start right there. You don't have to say anything else other than, and they'll go, well, what do you mean? And you go, I'm not ready to talk about it yet. That was hard enough for me to say. And so you take tiny little steps that are actually huge steps in beginning to unmask, in beginning to find your voice. I was working with a patient when I wrote this book, and who had come in specifically for perfectly hidden depression. And she was a very eloquent person, And I used a lot of her words, her verbiage in the book. And I asked her if I could. But she was the one who said, you need to talk about you're breaking your silence. And I said, oh, yeah. And so that is the name of the last chapter. I can't quote it right now, but it's something about breaking the silence of your depression. And because that silence that is so full of shame and yet also so comforting at times, and such a protection because you're so afraid of what will happen if you reveal vulnerability. Actually, John, when I first started on social media back in 2012, I've had 2 divorces. I've had a history of anorexia and still deal with some eating disorder thinking. I have panic disorder. I've had performance anxiety for years. And I had this, well, am I going to talk about that? Or are people going to say, well, I'd never go to her. She's a wacko or, whatever. And I said, yes. How can I expect and this was way before the book, how can I expect people to come into my office and say, this is something I struggle with, if I can't be honest about myself and recognize that, again, having panic attacks or having 2 divorces does not define me any more than the things that I'm proud of or that I like about myself. They're things that just are me. They're just who make me me. And so I started doing that from the very get-go, and much to my surprise in some ways, but joy in many, many others, people have said to me, it's so nice to have someone who is a mental health professional and is as transparent as you are. So, I'm glad I made that choice. I continue to make that choice. Writing a book was very difficult, being a perfectionist myself, because I realized the minute I submitted it to the publisher, I was either going to find out something new, like this low awareness OCD. And since then I found out all kinds of things, bukus of things that I would have loved to have put in the book. Some things in the book I don't really agree with anymore, a few things, not many. I wish I had expounded or expanded in a different way or said it in a different way. So, that's growing. That's curiosity. That's, and I'm told other writers feel the same way. So that, I guess I'm in a good crowd. But it was hard. And I remember the day that I finally said, it's going to be okay. The book will not be, it will be an imperfect guide to imperfectionism.
Wow, thank you so much for being, real and transparent. It's sadly refreshing, I guess I would say. I mean, you think back to our training of like tabula rasa and like stoic, and you shouldn't even have a picture of your family in your office. Yeah,
I remember.
And I think for a lot of people, yeah, that's definitely shifting. Where a lot that are on social media,
there's a huge point about transparency, and obviously you can carry that too far.
Sure. If you hijack the sessions.
How many people have come to you and me and said, I went to another therapist and all she or he did was talk about themselves, and I felt more like I was there for them than they were there for me. So that's obviously inappropriate and unethical and all kinds of things that are harmful. But to occasionally use your own experience or your own struggles to, in fact, I remember the first time I told somebody I was depressed, I had been divorced twice, was someone who was sitting on my sofa, shaming herself, oh my Lord, for getting her second divorce. And she looked up at me and she said, but I know you wouldn't know what that feels like. And out of my mouth popped, well, you're about to join a club I've been a member of for a long time. And she just looked at me, you? And I said, yeah. I said, I don't really want to go into it, but just know that, sometimes what you project onto other people because of your shame is not accurate.
And so I did want to hit you with one curveball before we wrap up. If you were in control of the DSM, where would you put PhD? Would it be a personality disorder? Would it be a part of the major depression? Yeah, where would you?
No, because I don't think it. you actually can have very successful relationships with other people. So that part of personality disorders that seem to suggest that this is a very dysfunctional way of relating to other people. I don't think it, I think it's where it's harmful is for you. It's not necessarily harmful in your interrelating. As I think about it now, you're right. This is kind of a curveball, but I'd put it as a large asterisk, a very large asterisk in the
major depressive.
In major depression, dysthymia, I would say something about that I had such a good question a few minutes from someone who's not even a healthcare professional. She said, well, is it really depression that's underneath the perfectionism, or is it something else? And I looked at her and I said, well, there's certain aspects of classic depression that it does hold. You feel helpless. You feel isolated, but it doesn't look like you're isolated. You can feel hopeless. You can feel suicidal. You can have moments of emotional pain, but they're quickly suppressed. So it's depression, but it's not going to look like classic depression.
Yeah, like you said, with a big asterisk.
So a big asterisk. Mm-hmm. Beware.
There you go.
There is another animal. There's another close cousin of this that is going to look like the perfect looking life, and you must pay attention to the ability to connect with pain openly and allow yourself to cry, allow yourself to get angry, allow yourself to actually connect with those feelings, because to me, that's the most obvious thing that they cannot do. And it's the more you hone your skills in doing it. By now, I can pretty well tell if someone walks in and they don't even have to tell me too much that they're here because of my writing.
Awesome. Wow. Margaret, thank you so much again. And I know you were generous enough to offer up that I'll post this on social media for the first person that writes in an autographed copy of the book. So
sure.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And they can follow along at the drmargaretrutherford.com. They can find you on social media and check out the Instagram. I almost hesitate to ask, you got any other projects in the works that you're...
Well, I do see about 30 patients a week.
Wow.
So.
Okay. There you go.
And of course the podcast, the SelfWork podcast. So, I stay pretty busy, but I'm as I tell the story about the woman who had my book on her nightstand, I'm trying to make it my mission in life to create an environment therapeutically and in our culture where people are looking for this, and in their children, in their spouses, in their friends, in their work colleagues, to where you're just aware and you can say, you never seem to be bothered by anything. Sometimes I wonder what's underneath all that, and have those kinds of conversations.
That's such a huge need.
That's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to make sure people understand that that's an okay question to ask. Someone may look at you and go, "No, I'm fine," but you asked. Mm-hmm. So maybe they would say, I wonder what she or he saw. Now, maybe they would say, and I've got to cover it up better. Or maybe they'd say, that would be a person I could actually talk to if I really decided to do that.
Well, and possibility of planting the seed in that conversation, right. And they double back around later and say, you know what, you asked that, but at the time I wasn't ready to answer it, but I am now.
Exactly. Yeah. Great point. Exactly.
Well, again, Margaret, I look forward to staying in touch with you and keeping an ear out for all that you're doing. Thank you so much for the book and just the concept, the term, the syndrome. I think it's going to make such a huge difference for people. So thank you.
Well, I'm very grateful, John, to you. I have been so blessed that as many people as are interested are, and you know, your listeners, if they have any questions for me, they can write me at askdrmargaret at drmargaretrutherford.com, and I will answer. It's a confidential email. And any other way, again, my Facebook group is facebook.com/group/selfwork. And I'm not there all the time, but it's a very diverse international group, and there are lots of people who post regularly, and it's about friendship and strength and empathy and laughter, and so we try to support each other in whatever mental health struggles that we tend to have. You too, John. Thank you very much.
That, OTC listeners, is episode 54 done and in the books. So thanks, as always, for checking out the episode. Dr. Margaret Rutherford, she was just such a joy to have on. It's such an important topic, and I think a different perspective, trying to help people understand that, the DSM, the Bible of psychology, as I always refer to it, it has all of those diagnostic codes and criteria in it. And that's a tool for us to use. They created it to try to help practitioners group together symptoms and, understand diagnoses and best practices and treatment methodologies for certain diagnoses. And it's useful. It's very important as a guide, but it's also just a guide. And that not everyone's symptoms don't always fit perfectly into those little check boxes. And, a concept, especially with depression, that has gotten a lot more awareness in the last couple of decades, but still a ways to go. Just the understanding that it doesn't always look like you think it should, or it doesn't always have a presentation that is just so obvious that, oh, this is depression, or this is anxiety. And a lot of times just the importance of connecting with people and talking with them and checking in on them to try to understand what a person might be dealing with. And especially with perfectly hidden depression, that mask of perfectionism is created to hide that. It's part of that defense. So again, as always, I hope you took something from it. I really appreciate you, spending the time to listen to the episode. And I will catch you all in episode 55. Take care.